and welcome to the Curious Cult podcast, the show where we talk to incredible people about their fascinating curiosity. I am your obsessively curious host, Nick Haralambous, and in this episode, Zev Siegl and I talk about the world of startups, a coffee obsession that led to the creation of one of the world's most impressive businesses, and oh so much more. Zev Siegl is a co-founder of Starbucks Coffee Company and served as founding vice president and a director from 1970 to 1980. Mr. Siegl has founded 5 small businesses in addition to Starbucks. He speaks globally at major entrepreneurship conferences, most recently in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, and Luxembourg. As a mentor and consultant, Mr. Siegl provides pro bono coaching to emerging small-scale new ventures. During the past 10 years, he has mentored more than 200 entrepreneurs. He has also coached MBA candidates and student teams at 2 university business schools in Seattle. Mr. Siegl understands the issues that confront first-time entrepreneurs, and he is passionate about enabling startup leaders of new ventures to make good decisions. This is a conversation I've been waiting for a very long time. Let's get started. Zev, thank you so much for joining me today on the Curious Cult Show. Before we dive in, I'd love for you to tell my listeners a little bit about yourself.
My name is Zev Siegl, and I'm known as one of the co-founders of Starbucks Coffee Company. But there's actually quite a bit more in my life. I was a co-founder of Starbucks along with 2 friends, but that was many years ago. I was a co-founder and vice president throughout the 1970s, a long time ago. And since then, I've been involved in the whole world of small business, for about 50 years. And I'm in my 70s now. I've worked with more than 500 first-time or young entrepreneurs and business owners. And they've taught me a great deal by observing them and listening to them and hearing their issues. I feel like I've gotten a PhD in startup business from them. Mm-hmm. And I've also started other businesses myself after Starbucks. And I think I have quite a broad base of experience, in particular with the part of new companies in which they go to investors and raise money for the first time. That's one of the areas that I'm really knowledgeable about.
Amazing. Well, I think that fits perfectly in the line of thinking and questioning and research that I'm doing for my second book called The Curiosity Catalyst. So with your 50 years of startup experience, let's dive into our questions and take you back many years and ask you about yourself. Were you a curious child? How does curiosity fit into your childhood?
My parents used to describe me as a hyperactive child. older sister and a younger brother, but I was the one who was really hyperactive, couldn't sit still, all over the house, all outside, where's Zev? And I think I created a lot of stress for my parents because I just couldn't focus. I had to change what I do, constantly.
And that's interesting. Did you kind of grow out of that as you got into high school or as an adult?
Last month.
Touché.
I would say that it wasn't until about 15 years ago when I was in when I was about 60 years old that I actually noticed that I could focus a lot longer. I really have a mind that cannot pay attention to one thing, which was incredibly useful to me as a startup guy.
Absolutely. I do think that I've done my research and discovered this phrase called expert generalists, people who have a diverse set of interests but go deeply into a very specific set of things. And I do think that this kind of ADHD traits that startup founders have helps them be a jack of all trades and a master of one.
I agree with you completely, Nick. And my observation is that there is a certain portion of people interested in doing startups who are ADHD. It makes it very hard for them to get along in larger organizations, such as corporations and government agencies, because in those settings, focus is an asset.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you must have found when you were younger, high school, a kid, that your ADHD was disruptive to those around you. And I'm sure it affected the way that you studied and learned throughout. Can you comment on that?
Well, I think it was more noticeable when I was in what we call elementary school in the United States, when I was, say, 8 to 10 years old. And Yeah, I think I posed problems, not to the point of disrupting classrooms, but it would be described by teachers as restlessness.
Yeah.
But that's a cover for ADHD.
And speaking of your teachers, and you were talking earlier about your family, is there anyone that you can remember specifically that sparked a deeper curiosity in you that kind of led you down the path that you're on?
Oh, yes. And I think that's true of all people except for egomaniacs. Oh, yes. I had an uncle, my mother's brother, who introduced me to business. What he would do is take me to his office,
Uh-huh.
which his business was a meat processing company. And, I could hang out with the fellas and see how they did things. Another very big influence on me, I keep their picture in my house, is a couple who were part of the Madison Avenue that's now, thought of as one of the peaks of advertising. We're talking about Madison Avenue in the 60s. And they were both involved in it. A married couple with no kids, and as often happens with married couple with no kids, they took an interest in their friends' kids. And I was one of those lucky kids. And my goodness, I learned so much from just casual remarks they would make about things going on at work. So those are specifically people, that couple and my uncle, who made a huge influence on me. Sometimes they pop up in my dreams still. But I also was greatly influenced by my parents and their friends. My father was a professional musician. He was a concertmaster of a symphony orchestra. And my mother was an educator who, after we moved to Seattle, gradually opened a school that still exists. There are about 200 kids there every day. My parents are not with us anymore. But in that milieu of educators and professional musicians, I got a real grounding in the diversity of people that exist in the world. And something I'm really thankful for.
Speaking of diversity, my next question is actually around the culture and society that people grow up in, and how, in your experience, that sparks or detriments their requirement for curiosity, having dealt with so many startups. And I mean, obviously you and I have a friendship outside of this podcast. I know that you've spoken at a lot of conferences around the world. In your experience, do different countries and cultures promote curiosity in a different way? Have you seen anything to suggest that?
It's quite an interesting question, Nick. I have spoken at conferences in many different countries, about 20 of them. And I would say that there are some subtle differences. For example, in the Gulf region, where there is quite a bit of money, I think it's difficult for governments there, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. I think it's difficult for them to get young people in their late 20s and early 30s, a time when a lot of folks begin to think about starting a company. It's difficult to get them to take risk because there's such a strong safety net. If they just go to university and graduate and enter a profession, they'll be taken care of for life. So you find those governments really pushing hard to get people to take an interest in entrepreneurship. And there is some interest. But it's nothing like you would find in, say, California. And in other countries, there are certain other factors. Very frankly, in poor countries, there's a lot of entrepreneurship, but it's not the kind of entrepreneurship that Silicon Valley knows about. It's survival. And for instance, I love going to Mexico, which is a medium wealthy country on average. And when I'm there, I see so many small businesses. Sometimes there are people having a second job, what we call moonlighting in the United States. A guy will repair cars after working for Pepsi-Cola as a driver during the day. A woman will make, in addition to looking after her family's needs, will bake products that are taken to restaurants. Well, that's entrepreneurship on a small scale. And I see a tremendous amount of that.
That's really interesting. In terms of formal education, so something that I'm quite curious about is the tertiary education institutions and how they promote curiosity versus a stable and set path for students. And what comes to mind here is Steve Jobs not actually enrolling in any classes, but just popping in and out of classes that interest him at university. What's your experience with tertiary education as someone who's looking at young people, as well as someone who has gone through the education process?
It's quite interesting. There are a couple of ultra famous entrepreneurs in the United States who dropped out of Harvard after a year or two.
Yeah.
And, that people like to point at that. Well, I would say that it's quite often that educational institutions, don't do such a wonderful job of promoting inquiry and free thinking. But individual teachers do. And everyone I know, and probably everyone listening, has had experience with individual teachers who really connected with them and caused them to think in new ways. I have had lots of teachers like that. I don't think I'm unusual.
No, me too.
They stimulate interest. So I would say, while institutions sometimes get a little rigid, that the individual teachers in certain classrooms are just the opposite. They're promoting inquiry.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic perspective. Can you, off the top of your head, think of any of your lecturers who really stood out for you?
Oh, of course. I think everyone listening can. You don't forget these people because they have such strong connections with you.
Yeah.
Oh, an English teacher when I was in the 10th grade. I still, am fascinated by the English language. And I had a Spanish teacher about the same time, just a fascinating fireball of a teacher. She invested a lot of energy in her classes. And I wasn't a very good student of hers. Interestingly enough, I still study Spanish, and I attribute that to Mrs. Daquila, who was my teacher when I was 15 years old. Yeah, these people, you never, ever forget them. And there were teachers at the university, too, also, that had a fantastic amount of influence. Just, that people talk about, they open your eyes.
It's so funny you say one of my standout teachers is also an English teacher and also around grade 10 and 11 for me. He was the guy who taught me the phrase, "My knowledge is to you like pearls before swine." He used to make a nice little mockery of us. He was brilliant though, Mr. Folds. I still remember his name 20 years later.
It's not difficult to remember those people's names.
No, it's crazy. So I'm interested in how you learned about business. Was it a curiosity of yours? Did you study it formally? It's obviously an obsession of yours.
I did not. Yeah, it is an obsession of mine. It has been for a long, long time, decades. I want to just clarify that my interest in business is at the beginning of businesses in those terrible first 2 years.
The 0 to 1.
Yeah, well, 0 to 1, and then 1 to 2, and then hopefully by that time the business is starting to run on its own.
Yeah.
The question of where the interest came from, I would say from the uncle I mentioned. Another influence that I've thought of more recently is my mother was a founder of an important school here for young children. Mm-hmm. And there was something that happened that I think I'm attaching more importance to now than I did then. When I was about 20 years old, my mother had board meetings of the school at our dining table. She would invite the board members to come to her house, and they would conduct their meetings around the table. And these were serious thinkers who were really trying to help her make her school last a long time. And I would, be in the next room sometimes, and I would hear what they were talking about. And, I'll bet that the sum total of the things that I overheard could be recorded in, 60 minutes over, that period of time. That maybe there's a grand total of 60 minutes of exposure. But I think it had a big influence on me. The dynamics of how this nonprofit institution was working for survival with a team of advisors who were the board of directors.
Wow, that's very interesting. And do you think that informed the kind of business person you became?
Yeah, I'm not an egomaniac at all. I really believe that teams are important. For small businesses, I like to encourage the people that I help to have not just a board of directors who are almost always insiders and leading investors, but to also have a board of advisors who have no fiduciary responsibility, there's no legal responsibility, but they're very useful in giving advice. And yeah, I think that's extremely important. And that's a direct outcome of the exposures that I had as a kid.
So interesting. And so when you think of the word innovation, having dealt with so many startups and built so many businesses yourself, how would you define it and explain it to someone, that phrase, innovation?
Well, innovation is often thrown around, especially in entrepreneurship circles. It's an important concept. But except for rare situations, I think what it really is insightful, adaptive reuse. That young men and women who are starting companies, what they're actually doing is taking an idea from over on the left and an idea from over on the right and combining them in a new way that appears to be something new, but is actually what I call adaptive reuse. And you're able to do this just by a sort of a freedom of thinking and being slightly insightful. That to me is what innovation is.
The interesting thing for me is that people who do this adaptive reuse that you speak of often aren't aware that they're doing it. They don't believe they're being innovative. They're just doing the thing that comes naturally to them. And so my question to you is, when you guys early on were obsessing over coffee and doing this adaptive reuse, were you aware of what you were creating?
Well, the answer is we were creating a coffee business in Seattle, Washington. We weren't conquering the world. But there's a great story that has to do with the period in the months before we actually opened the company. And it has to do with the selection of the name, Starbucks Coffee Company. We selected the name the way that everyone does. We made lists of names. We all contributed. There were three of us. We all contributed, and sometimes our friends would throw in a name, and that was just fine. And then once in a while, we would cross off some names that were clearly not useful. One of them, by the way, was our names: Bowker, Baldwin, and Siegel. Can you imagine if it was that? Finally, our attorney wanted the name so he could file the corporate papers. He sort of eliminated our freedom to think about names. He just said, you got to do it, and you got to do it today.
Yeah.
So we did. And the name that we had several names, none of which was Starbucks, but one of them led directly to somebody blurting out the name Starbucks. How about that? Starbucks. And we said, yeah, that sounds good. It's easy to say, easy to remember. Yeah, let's use Starbucks. So I would call that completely apropos to what we're talking about, which is this adaptive reuse. Now, it turned out that Starbucks had a lot of associations, particularly in literature, and particularly in Moby Dick. But at the time we chose the name, we didn't know that. It was subtle. It was in the background.
Yes.
We just weren't aware that we were choosing a name from Moby Dick.
Yes, it was more by osmosis than anything else.
Yeah, and I would call that a kind of adaptive reuse. You know, it just like a little bit of an insight. Yeah, that name sounds great. No, as it turned out, it is a truly great name, not just because the company is big, but the name contributed to the success of the company.
Absolutely.
Lucky, huh?
Absolutely. I mean, it's so funny. People probably turn it into this big myth that you guys carefully thought out this incredible name that could go global. And the truth is, you were three young guys building a business and needed a name because your lawyer was putting pressure on you.
That's really the truth of the story.
One of my early businesses was a company called Motribe, Motribe. And we were sitting in our cubicles, myself and my co-founder, and he said, listen, we've built the prototype. We need a name now. And I was like, well, what do we do? And he says, well, what we do is we build tribes on your mobile phone. And I was like, great, let's try Motribe. And he said, there is no ways that the domain name motribe.com is available. And I literally typed it in and it was available and we took it and it cost me $11.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's a great story. By the way, regarding naming, what I always tell people is you can pick the name of the company. The name of the company doesn't have to describe what you do. That can go in a statement line underneath your name.
Absolutely. That's Starbucks, right?
Yeah, for instance, Starbucks coffee, tea and spices, as it was originally known. There's better living through chemistry. That was a huge popular phrase. You can have your aunt's dog's name as long as you have a good tagline underneath it, and you can keep changing the tagline.
Yeah, you can
Nobody
evolve.
ever notices when you change.
So something that correlates quite closely to innovation and curiosity is this word obsession. In almost every guest that I've had on the show and every interview I've done for the book, the word obsession comes up a lot. And I mean, were you guys really obsessed with coffee? I mean, you didn't just start Starbucks. You started more than one coffee company. Was coffee always an obsession for you?
Starbucks was definitely an obsession for me and for my partners. When we started the company, 26, 27 years old. We had all been to college. We all had a first job, and the three of us each wanted something a little bit more in life. And we tripped into the idea of coffee. It was one of the many business ideas that we looked at. And as the doors gradually opened, into the coffee world, as we started to see what it was, we definitely became obsessed. It's a field that is so rich in history and nuance that it just completely consumed us. Yeah, I would say we were obsessed.
Amazing. And this concept of hiring for curiosity, when I left university, my dean of students said to me, your philosophy degree is going to hold you in good stead because you can train people how to do just about anything except for think. And philosophy teaches you how to think. So curiosity and hiring for that as a trait has become quite popular. Is it something that through your career you noticed your favorite or most reliable people or most interesting people that you worked with were the most curious?
I would say that this is now, I'm not speaking for me and for my partners. I'm speaking only for me now, that in my life, I like hiring for a well-balanced personality and intelligence. I find that people who don't have a lot of psychological problems and who are intelligent, I'm not talking about rocket scientists, just generally more intelligent than the average.
Yeah.
That these are people that can really help an organization.
Okay, interesting. One of the things that I think we are suffering from as a culture right now is businesses that are slaves to their shareholders and shareholder value, and they use the wrong metrics to measure success and measure their people. For example, profit, how much time you spend at work. Do you think this is an actual problem? And if so, how do you see that we move past this?
Well, this is an area where we might have divergent opinions, Nick. Funding is a necessity for most businesses. Not all businesses, but it's a necessity for most emerging companies. Mm-hmm. And in order to obtain the funding, you have to pay attention to the things that are important to the funders. And there are basically two kinds of funders. Initially, there are investors, some of whom may be relatives or family at the very beginning, and then friends of family who have some money, and people you've met in various ways who have some money and are interested in businesses. And then finally, you get to lenders, banks. In most countries, banks don't jump in early. There are some exceptions to that. But in order to make those people happy, if you want to think of it, in order to get the fuel that you need to power your business, you have to do some things to make them happy. And one of them is to have a coherent financial forecast in addition to a plan for your business. And this is bad news, very sad news to many entrepreneurs who really don't want to be confined to the financial realities, because having to produce a profit on a schedule kind of restrains their freedom. You have to do it. Ignoring the needs, and then that's a general statement, and then the particular investors, and everyone I know who has started more than one company has quite a jaundiced view of investors. Investors are difficult for entrepreneurs for many reasons. One is sometimes they think they know more about your business that you've been obsessing about for 2 years than you do, which may or may not be true. Usually not true. And also they have egos, just like everyone else. And they may want to express those egos. Also, the sad truth is they don't have to invest in your business. They can just leave their money where it is. And that gives them a tremendous amount of leverage over entrepreneurs. So you can't ignore the sources of funding, and that's a problem. It's just a reality. With bigger companies, for instance, tech companies who are getting their funding from venture capital. Venture capital, by the way, is professionally managed money. You're not dealing with the investor now. You're dealing with somebody who's paid by the investor to manage their money. And venture capitalists, whoo, boy, they are really tough on entrepreneurs. And there are endless stories about bad relationships and disillusions of all kinds from venture capitalists. But the people I deal with aren't dealing with venture capitalists. They're dealing with what we call angel and individual investors.
Don't you think, so the interesting part for me is that angels, I think you're right, angels and seed investors have good intentions and look for key metrics that let them know if a startup is on the right path. But don't you think that sets up startups for failure, like the WeWork issue with SoftBank and this insane valuation, insane amount of funding for insane levels of growth that lead to detrimental societal impact as well as harm to the staff in the business? And I think that's kind of my concern with where we are now in the world of startups and this startup boom and bust that we're going through.
Well, yeah, WeWork is one of the great stories, isn't it? Now that company is on its second bank, which may also find it problematic. The whole WeWork premise was kind of odd, don't you think? You know, we'll rent these spaces and create little societies in them, and it's like buying space wholesale and selling it retail. But it's just an odd concept for a boom situation. You know, it's hard to imagine why it had to be so crazily large. By the way, I live in Seattle, and there is a new WeWork space opening about 4 blocks from where I'm sitting right now. Right now.
Incredibly, I live in Cape Town, and they've just opened a brand new WeWork space here. It's astounding the reach that they managed to get in such a short period of time. Yeah,
well, it's also astounding because, you know, after their big failure and the exit of the founder, they're still expanding.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's a tendency among small startups, like tech startups, where there's an exciting new platform for the internet or software for a specific purpose in the business world. There's a tendency to immediately jump to some of the biggest companies in the world, like, say, Starbucks. I mean, there's a tendency to start thinking that the Starbucks and WeWork actually apply to small little companies. I don't think so. I'm not a person who, I mean, when I am working with people and they start talking about, well, this is going to be just like Starbucks, I say, well, you're talking about the Starbucks today. That company's been around for 50 years. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a company that was an instant success. My partners and I started Starbucks in the mid-'80s. It was sold to a group led by Howard Schultz. And it took him 35 years to get where the company is now. It wasn't a lightning. In retrospect, it appears to be. But, you know, 35 years is a long time. And with some of the people who I try to help, 35 days is a long time.
That's very true. So, and that's an interesting segue into the concept of failure and how it relates to the idea of curiosity and innovation. In my experience, environments that embrace failure and provide a safe space for their teams to understand how to fail and learn quickly are the ones that are most often the curious ones and innovative ones that succeed. In your personal life and your business experience, how have you dealt with failure?
Well, I have had a couple of failures in my life, business failures, and they were no fun. I learned from them, but I could have learned without them too. I never recommend failure as a means to educate yourself. The emotional toll, the toll on friendships is just too great. It's a very poor value of failure. But I have had to deal with it. The emotional toll that was just awful for me. I pretty much lost my mind in one case, and it took a year to get it back again. Yeah, I don't recommend it at all. You know, for many years you would hear, especially venture capital executives say, "Oh yeah, we won't touch anyone who hasn't failed at least once." I would always think when I heard that, wow, You want people who have been through that? Why not have people who have an unrelenting history of small successes? Wouldn't that be better? So, failure is survivable, but it takes a great toll, and it's nothing to wear. It's not something that one should wear on one's sleeve as a badge of courage. I'm working with people who have ideas that are going to fail, in my opinion, that are going to fail before they become real businesses. That is, the ideas are going to be abandoned. Some would say that's a failure. I would call that good analysis.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely understand. It is interesting that you've got such a different perspective on failure, because you actually took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say to you, most of the VCs I know and have raised money from prefer that I've had some failures. I'm not a first-time founder. They feel like it gives them some kind of bankable experience of their founders.
Would they also be excited if you weren't a first-time founder but had a minor success recently?
Probably more so, yeah.
Yeah, so this emphasis on failure as a positive, I'm not a subscriber to that one.
Okay, interesting. How do you personally allocate time in your mind to wonder and think and contemplate and research things that interest you? Do you actually carve out that time, or is your day filled with work stuff?
That's really an interesting one, Mike. Remember, I'm a random thinker.
Yes, so tell us.
So I can always carve out time. It happens. I'll be working on a tax form that I have to consider. And the next thing I know, I've set it aside and I'm writing an email to a guy halfway around the world with a great idea for something he might consider for his business. So I would say that for random thinkers, there's never a time when you can't let your mind wander and think. Now, is that a good thing? No. I think that a person looking at me like doing a time motion study and what I do over a period of 8 hours would just howl with laughter at how inefficient I am. But I am still somewhat of a random guy, and it's something I have to deal with. So in my case, letting my mind wander, not an issue.
Okay.
But for other people, it may take a little more of a structure, like going to the beach and walking for 3 miles up and down the sand. That can be extremely liberating. Your mind relaxes. The sound of the waves lapping at the shore starts to free up your thinking. These are things that can really be effective.
Yeah. And how do you choose what to focus on at a specific point in time? And I'm not referring to your day now. I'm more interested in the bigger concepts that interest you. Some of my guests have spoken to me about their fear of climate change, and they spent the last 2 years researching energy and the history of energy in the world. How do you choose what to focus on when you get curious?
Well, my general focus is small business. The emerging of new companies and the problems of getting the right people and money together, making sure the idea has a market. These are things I think about constantly. Not in relation to, I do not own a company at this time. I'm only counseling other people who have companies or want to have companies. And I think about them all the time. Typically, I have about 6 or 7 young entrepreneurs who I'm in touch with pretty often, say weekly, often by FaceTime or emailing back and forth, sending documents to look at. And they are who I think about outside of the most important things, my friends and my family. And I think about the difficulties of the problems. Should that person get a CFO now, or should they wait? These are, they seem like minor, very finite issues, but they do consume me, and they are all, outside of my friends and family, they are all related to making the company gel and be successful.
Very interesting. So Zev, Bringing this episode to a close, we would be remiss not to talk about the global pandemic sweeping the countries of the world. And I'm very specific. I'm not a medical expert, nor are you. So my interest here as the final question is, how do you think a global pandemic like the one we're facing with COVID-19 affects small business and their strategies over the long term?
Well, that last phrase that you used, over the long term, changes the question dramatically.
Yes.
And makes it much more interesting. In the short term, of course, everybody knows what's going to happen. It's going to be terrible.
Yeah.
Small businesses are going to suffer, and the families that are involved in those are also going to suffer.
Yeah.
And the long term, that's a different question. There will be gradually opportunity in coffee bar industry. I think a third to a half of the wonderful little coffee bars that we love are going to go out of business. They're not that profitable that they can, for instance, borrow money and pay it back over time, which is one of the options being offered in many countries. I think they're just going to go away. And it will be a long time before they're replaced, but they will be replaced. There's going to be opportunity on the way back up after the bottom is hit, whenever that comes. Probably this fall will be the bottom. But in the meantime, the suffering is going to be so great. And also, I think that there's going to be a big issue with capital. There's going to be a lot of capital that's going to go up in smoke over the next few months. Well, we've already seen the deflation of marketable securities, stocks. Well, that always has an effect on the funding for entrepreneurs, because what happens is the large investors look at that. They look at their financial statements every week, and they say, oh, gosh, we have to be careful now. So that 10% that I've set aside for taking higher risk flyers in making investments in new companies, I can't do that now because my overall portfolio has shrunk so much. And we're going to see a lot of that this fall, too, where companies that are totally plausible, with the right people at the right time with the right idea, they're going to have a hard time getting funding. And I just hate it that that's going to happen. So I'm somewhat pessimistic. Now, on the other hand, if you have a new way of testing for the virus that tells you in 20 seconds whether or not you have this virus or the next virus or the virus after that, boy, those guys are going to make a fortune.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that once the dip comes, like you say, there will be this boom, but there's going to have to be a bust that precipitates it first.
I wouldn't call it a boom in the sense of an overnight flood of money.
Agreed.
But in 2008, there was a tremendous downturn around the world led by a banking crisis in the United States caused by excessive lending. Within 4 years after that, things were pretty much back to normal. But that's 4 long years.
Yeah. In startup world, 4 years may as well be an eternity.
Oh, yeah, that's crazy. One thing that might happen is that some of the insightful minds, the curious, the innovators might find it productive to work within large organizations and try and get large organizations to move ahead. A company that's based here in Seattle is famous for that, Amazon.
Yeah.
Amazon.com, if you talk to people that work there in lower mid-level positions, when an idea comes up, hey, why don't we think about doing this in this one little part of the company? If it seems promising, they set aside, they allocate people and money to researching it. And I can imagine easily that will become more common in other big companies, and that it will be a home for innovators and liberal thinkers to get that wonderful feeling that you get of creating something new, that it might have to be done for a while through well-capitalized existing corporations rather than independent.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Zev, that is it from my side. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you on this episode. Thank you so much for all your time and for your contributions to the startup world.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you for listening to the Curious Cult podcast, the show where we talk to incredible people about their fascinating curiosity. If you like this episode, please rate the show, like it, share it, and generally be kind to us and tell people about it. My goal is to spark curiosity that changes the world, and you can help by talking about the show to anyone who will listen. Stay curious. Until next time.